Today, I'm going to begin a series of several talks which are meant to be a companion to a new work which has come out, which I had the privilege of being able to author, on the rediscovery of the human, psychological writings of Viktor E. Frankl on the human in the image of the divine. And this is a book which has been published and is available both in hard copy and as an ebook. And I believe that it will be of some use if I explicate certain outlines of this work. Frankl, as we all know, is a person of great importance in the world of psychology. He is no longer alive, but his work, Man's Search for Meaning, was one of the most popular works of the second half of the 20th century. I think the Library of Congress mentioned that it was one of the 10th most read books of that period. I don't know if that includes as the pot boilers or not, but it is a work which is a classic, and it had an enormous resonance, and it was translated into many languages, and Frankl is in many places it's still a household word. Notwithstanding that, Frankl's work did not make it, certainly during much of his lifetime, into mainstream professional and academic psychology and psychiatry. And one of the reasons for this could well be, certainly for the earlier phase of the second half of the 20th century, was the extraordinary dominance of Freudian psychology, which in fact is in many ways quite antithetical to his approach, even though we'll see that Frankl sought in some ways to redeem Freud's work and thought very highly of it, but saw that it required a fundamental transposition in order to be incorporated in a manner which could be harmonized with his own. However, nowadays, in a situation where psychology is operating in society, and in a way which is become extraordinarily contentious, the importance of Frankl's work surfaces again as a key issue, because Frankl's work employs the dimension of the human spirit, the human soul, or to use a more secular equivalent for that term, the concept of the human conscience. And this issue of whether the human being is, in addition to being a physical and a mental being, also a spiritual being, is a key decision which psychology must resolve in the present time. Just as in contemporary society, it must be determined and must be resolved whether the human being is a spiritual being with a spiritual moral compass or not, because the consequences of rejecting the notion that the human being has a soul, has a moral compass, and that there are certain universal aspects of this moral compass and this human conscience are profound. Very briefly, we're living in a society now where the very foundations of human personality are being challenged. What is a human being? Is a human being a person who is largely determined by impulses, by emotions, by perceptions? Or is the human being a person, an individual, a personality, which is also, or equally, or even primarily determined by conscience? If the person is both, which is a fair statement to make, that a person is both what Frankl called a psychophysical complex, a complex of emotions and perceptions, as well as a spiritual reflective dimension, then we have to understand the relationship between these two dimensions. Because to put the matter very, very, very bluntly, contemporary psychology, with its model of the human being, that has tended to favor the view that the human being is primarily a psychophysical organism and not a creature of conscience, is itself an ideology which is altering the world and impacting deeply on the human being. Nowhere do we see this more today than in the whole area of gender ideology, which is actually reconstructing the human being, or some people would say deconstructing the human being. The impact is enormous. And the idea of gender fluidity and the whole quest to redefine what a human being is psychologically has supplied validity or legitimacy for legislation across the world, which has altered the family, which has altered the whole notion of what gender identity is, has set in train a whole legislation which permits children to embark upon so-called transitioning, which has created a vast domain of change and flux in human personality and in the family and in the whole concept of the moral dimension, or let's put it differently, what the issue, the basic core issue of the identity of the human being itself. Not only in the realm of our gender ideology is a psychology which removes and eschews the human spirit, a highly responsible, when I say responsible, maybe we should even use the word a culpable element. But a psychology which removes the human spirit, which removes the concept of the soul or the conscience, is also an ideological factor in a whole new attitude towards life. We find that as much as gender ideology is sweeping and influencing legislative activity, the same applies to the concept of the sanctity of life. And the sanctity of life is also predicated on a model of the human being which contains a soul. Because it is the soul, traditionally, in terms of which the human being was said to be made in the image of God and to possess something divine, which gave life its sanctity. A contemporary psychology which excises the soul from the human being provides also a legitimation for legislation which takes into consideration only the pain and the pleasure of the human being. It legitimates the taking of prenatal life. It legitimates the taking of life at the end of life, when there is unfortunately, suffering, illness, depression, and so on and so forth. If there is no soul and the human being is simply a bundle of sensory experiences of pain and pleasure, a collection of psychological self-perceptions, then it is possible to institute voluntary assisted suicide. It's possible to bring in euthanasia. It's possible to bring in abortion on demand, and in highly radical forms, because the model of the human being supplied by contemporary psychology, which underpins so much of this legislation culture today, says that we don't know what you're talking about when you mention a soul. There is no objective value in the human being. It is simply what the human being feels and what the human being perceives. The human being is a sentient and perceptory organism, and that is as far as it goes. That is what constitutes human identity and human autonomy, and that's the soul, and that is the foundation for human decisions. So the model of the human being for which psychology is so much responsible in ideological and cultural terms, is something which brings upon itself tremendous consequences in our civilization today. Just as Freud impacted culture vastly, so also today a mechanistic psychology, or a psychology at all events which ignores the spiritual dimension of the human being, is responsible to a major degree for what is going on in our society and culture today. And this is why I was so much concerned. It was not wholly my initiative by any means. Many people had proposed this, and great people had proposed it, that the work of Viktor Frankl be revisited. Because Viktor Frankl is without any question a great psychologist. There's no doubt about his influence on contemporary culture and society. It's just that whilst grassroots picked up Viktor Frankl, academia and the professional psychologists, for some reason, did not. And that's very worrying, because it is academia and the professional psychologists who are the ones who actually impact our society more. The grassroots are there, and they can have their resurgence at certain times, and they will have their resurgence. But we need to see, it's very important that professional and academic psychology come squarely to terms with a very great psychologist who recognized the human spirit or soul as an integral part of the human being, and did so as a psychologist, not just as a person with an opinion or with religious beliefs, but who saw that the spiritual dimension of the human being is critical to the psychological treatment of the human being. Okay, now there's a lot to be said, and what this book does is two things. First of all, it translates a number of key essays of Frankl, and it's not my purpose to give synopses of these articles, of these essays. I translated most of them, and one of them was translated by the niece of Viktor Frankl, the late Liesl Kozma. But in addition to that, what it seeks to do is to introduce and explain and elucidate the project of Viktor Frankl and the way in which he sought to reintegrate the spiritual dimension into the total psychological treatment of the human being. And that's why I called this book The Rediscovery of the Human. It's the rediscovery of the human in the sense that it restores to psychology the spiritual dimension, the higher dimension of the human being, what Frankl would have called the essential dimension of the human being. It does not in any way ignore all of the methods and the research and the techniques which are available to psychotherapy. To the contrary, it saw itself as essentially supplementary and complementary to them. But it insisted that the spiritual higher dimension of the human being be considered in conjunction with them and have a very significant role there too. And to take us back to the point with which I began, the consequences are vast, because if the human being, in addition to having sexual emotions, perceptions, various gender perceptions, is also one who possesses a conscience and a power of reflection which rises above the psychophysical existence, which the person possesses, above the emotions, above the perceptions, then that quality of reflection and that quality of judgment and that quality of spiritual commitment is something which enters into the play of the human being itself. The human being then is no longer solely his or her emotions, no longer solely his or her transient perceptions, but is something more, is a reflective conscience which arbitrates amongst those emotions. Then a human being could say, for example, yes, I have various sexual predispositions. But there is another part of me which says, I reject those predispositions. I have a conflict between conscience and perception, conflict and impulse. And that conflict is essential to the integrity of the human being. And that the human being's conscience must be acknowledged at least as much, and if not more, than the fact of the variety of impulses and perceptions which the human being also has. And similarly, when it comes to the issue of despair and suicidal ideation, then there's one thing, then it is one thing to look at the human being and to say, yes, this person has all sorts of grounds for severe depression and anxiety, which could lead to suicide, which could lead to a request for euthanasia, so-called voluntary assisted suicide, and so on and so forth. But if we admit a second, that's that higher dimension of the human being, which says, I also possess a soul and a conscience, which makes me realize that life is actually sacred. It's not just an issue of pleasure or pain, the movement towards pleasure, flight from pain, but I am here and the human being is here for a reason, and that life is something which is sacred, it's divine property, and it's not to be disposed of at will. Then we have brought into the mix of the human personality a crucial counterweight to psychophysical drives, emotions, and malaises. And we therefore are able then to turn back to our parliaments, who in Victoria, for example, a state in Australia, and in fact the same is echoed elsewhere, made euthanasia into a rational decision, made euthanasia a so-called something which the human being can arrive at rationally. And this can only be so when the figures in the equation are the figures of the dimensions and the variables of pleasure, pain alone, essentially. Whereas the conscience dimension, once one brings in the human conscience, then a whole set of different factors play in the human psyche. And the human being is able to resist the pain and pleasure. So we don't welcome pain. We want to alleviate it at all costs. But there's enters a tremendous counterweight from conscience itself. So it is of the greatest importance to the human being and to society that psychology, which provides society with its model of the human being, rediscover the human being, which means to discover that the human being is not just mind and body, but also soul. Now, it's in view of that the work of Viktor Frankl is of such immense importance, and building on that work and seeking to incorporate his insights. Now, what struck me first and foremost amongst in the work of Viktor Frankl was an essay which I encountered, an essay, one of the essays which is translated in this work, which is called 10 Theses Concerning the Human, Concerning the Person. It's an essay which is translated from German in this volume. And in it, we find, I found a statement which absolutely, which moved me enormously and excited me immensely, not just because it expresses a theological truth, but because it was stated by a great psychologist as a statement of psychology. And this is it. The true discovery of the human, the inventio hominis, which means it's the same thing, that's the Latin expression for the discovery of the human, occurs in the imitatio Dei, in the imitation of God. That is the true discovery of the human being. And that is a statement which is found, which Frankl says is part of the human spirit. The human spirit is an objectivity, is an objective fact, And not only that, it has an objective constitution. And it actualizes and realizes itself in the imitation of God. And we'll discuss shortly what that actually means. Then there's another work of which I translated sections in this book, and it comes from a work published in 2005, which is based on an earlier transcript of a discussion between Viktor Frankl and an acquaintance and another colleague, friend of his, and it talks there about it's called, and it's I've translated some sections from that dialogue in a piece in this book called and I've called it The Science of the Soul. Now, here Frankl says that psychology has to be located within the higher or the more inclusive dimension of theology. It's an extraordinary statement. In other words, it says just like the human being has a soul, and therefore this soul is something which relates to the divine. And since this is, if you like, the height dimension of the human being, and there are all sorts of theological dimensions which relate to this aspect of the human being, therefore we must view the human within the encompassing framework of theology, because the human being is actually a spiritual being, and we know this. The human being knows it and experiences it inwardly, in turn when the person comes into contact with their own soul, but it's something which is also taught and elaborated and explained in theology itself. So he calls theology the higher and inclusive dimension of psychotherapy. It does not mean that therefore psychotherapy has to renounce its clinical dimension. Of course, it remains a practical science, but it cannot exist independently of the spiritual dimension of the human being. For that is a crucial factor. It is the higher dimension of the human being. And therefore, it is the dimension which is also inclusive in a way of a science of psychotherapy as well. Now, having said that, and having noted this extraordinary statement that Frankl says the human being possesses a higher faculty, call it conscience, call it soul, and having said that it has an objective structure, so to speak, it has an objective constitution, a moral framework we've built into it. It becomes necessary to address straight away an issue in Frankl's work itself, and that is that the Viktor Frankl who wrote that also revised it. In other words, Viktor Frankl, like so many of us, has in the course of his life different viewpoints, different beliefs, different standpoints. And there is a fundamental revision of this very standpoint which I've mentioned to you, and it's to be found in Frankl's own work. And I bring this out not just as a matter of scholarly integrity and thoroughness to point out that there is a contradiction in Frankl's work, but I do it in order to say that whilst these two strains exist in Frankl's work, as far as I am concerned, and I believe as far as the spiritual tradition is concerned, it must embrace one of these versions and reject the other version. And I'll just allude briefly to what Frankl did over here. So, I mean, this is all set out in the preface to the work, so and I cannot take a lot of time to deal with it right now. But very briefly, what it says is that in the first view, Frankl says there is an objective soul, and that there is also a creator, and that the soul and the creator exist in resonance and in relationship with one another. Moreover, he goes on to say that the there is a concept of the soul has a objective framework. There is a moral template built into the human being. And the third statement is that this moral standpoint, this activation of conscience comes about as a result of self-transcendence. In fact, one of the remarkable things of Frankl's work, consistent with this view, is that he says that the atheist and the agnostic, through a suitable process of self-transcendence, self-relativization, can come essentially to the same point as the religious person. That self-transcendence can lay bare the soul which has been repressed within the atheist or the agnostic. And fourthly, it becomes, as a result of this, absolutely out of the question that suicide could ever be a result or could ever be a response to human difficulty and despair. Now, the second view of Viktor Frankl revises each and every one of these propositions. The second version of the two theses, which was published sometime later in his work. And what it states there is it removes the word the imitation of God. Secondly, it relativizes religious experience. It says any meaning could do. Well, that worries me very deeply and worries others, because we know that the world is full of meanings, and there are some very strange meanings and some and ideological meanings. And then also he goes on then to say that in the second version, he seems also to remove the concept of the exposure of the soul through a process of transcendence by simply saying that everybody has their a priori value set, and we must simply take that as a fact. And finally, he comes on to say the most disturbing of all things, and that is that even suicide is a meaningful act. Now, this is in direct contradiction to what he wrote in other places. So I only mention this at the very outset to say that there was a tension in Frankl's own work, and that I embrace the perspective which Frankl set forth in the essays translated in this part. And this is the section. We're not taking Frankl as a prophet who has to be internally consistent. He is a person who obviously went through struggles and certain vicissitudes in his own life. He did a huge good, and I'm not and my purpose is not in any way to draw to make negative comments about him in any way whatsoever. But my purpose is to draw out the truth in his work, the essays which articulate a position upon which the whole spiritual tradition of humanity can build, and which is wholly consistent with the spiritual tradition of humanity. So that's that. Now the next thing is, this is just by way of general introduction before we get into the book itself and the introduction itself. We have to understand what this concept of objective spirit, objective conscience, soul, call it what you like. What is it, and what is it, and how does it chime with this concept of imitatio Dei, with the imitation of God? So, very briefly speaking, the notion of the imitation of God has various meanings. One is taken that it talks about human freedom and responsibility, which is a valid meaning. God is free, and and freedom was given to the human being to choose freely. That's one aspect. But I am more focused here on the concept of the imitation of God as the notion of an imitation of the divine attributes. And what this means is, in the words we said, just as God is kind, so shall you be kind. Just as God is merciful, so shall you be merciful. Just as God possesses judgment, so shall you possess judgment. And this is furthermore not something which is left in an abstraction, but rather this notion of the imitation of God, these attributes, are something which actually have not just general, but have also highly specific meaning. And there are in all 7 attributes of God which are set out in this current context. And these 7 attributes actually correspond in human conduct to the conduct of what's known as the Noahide laws. This is a tradition which comes from the beginnings of humanity, Noah, before, and it was the basis on which the humanity the new covenant was made with God after the flood. These were the values which were transmitted by Abraham to all the great world religions, not only of the West, Christianity and Judaism and Islam, if we regard that as a Western or an Occidental, whatever religion, but also to the religions of the East. And these are the core values known as the Noahide laws, 7 basic precepts. And these basic precepts, which are the belief in God and the respect for God, sexual morality, prohibition of theft, the prohibition of murder, the requirement of justice, and the proper treatment of nature and animals. So these 7 basic laws relate to 7 fundamental divine attributes which the human being is bound to imitate in conduct. I have written about this at some length in a book called The Theory and Practice of Universal Ethics, the Noahide laws. I did not invent the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws have been there since the beginning of humanity. They were reiterated to all humanity at Mount Sinai. And they find resonance in the world faiths. So it's not an invention. It is the legacy and the living tradition of all the world faiths. There's some which have got, I would call them the common denominator values of the faith. Some of the faiths go to this side, go to that side, and so on and so forth. But the root of it all the root of all is the Noahide laws. This is what is meant by the imitation of God. And what it says is that the human makeup is essentially a makeup which has a moral compass, and that structures personality. It structures the value, the attitude towards sexuality. It structures the attitude towards aggression. It structures the attitude towards life. It structures all of the attitudes which deal with the human, with which the human organism has to deal. And this, if you like, is the inbuilt moral compass of the human being. The human being is essentially, in spiritual terms, also a moral being. And this moral template is something which is harnessed, or put it this way, the psychophysical organism is harnessed to it. And the ideal of human well-being and human fulfillment and human purpose is that we make over our impulses, our perceptions in a way which is in conformity with this higher template. That gives us the norm of the healthy and purposeful human being. And this very issue is, of course, of absolutely burning significance in a time now where the human being is actually being reinvented through legislation, where life is being reinvented. The significance of life, I should say, is being reinvented or deconstructed in the present time. So this is the issue now of whether and how the human being, the human psyche, is anchored to a spiritual or a moral template, and that we cannot leave it without causing harm both to the human being and to society and to culture and civilization as a whole. So basically then, it is a question then of what it is that constitutes the healthy, purposeful human being. Now, ultimately this reference is to be found in the universal aspects of the human conscience itself, not in the fads of popular ideology and culture. So, and what is healthy is measured ultimately by this transcendent standard. It's a transcendent standard which, according to, as Frankl explains, can be discovered by every human being in him or herself through the process of self-transcendence. and consequently, that when psychology has to come to questions with whether an idea set of the human being is normal or pathological, normal or abnormal, it takes reference to this intrinsic moral spiritual template, which is part of the human being, which is the framework of ultimate framework of human personality. So the question of psychology will come now and say, well, our concern is not with a normative structure for human personality, but with a feeling of subjective well-being, then we're going to have all sorts of problems. Apart from the fact that subjective well-being, which is invoked to justify allowing an extraordinarily fluid and laissez-faire attitude towards life and gender and family and personal sexuality, is actually accompanied by phenomena of depression and anxiety, which may be unparalleled in history, in our contemporary society. Apart from that, the very fact that you will find a functioning individual with a pathological mindset, that itself does not mean that this is a ultimately healthy and purposeful human being. There are plenty of pathological individuals who function highly, unfortunately, or fortunately, however we look at it. And not only that, there are societies which have continued for thousands of years. And these may be, whether these are Western societies, or whether these are indigenous societies, which may have profoundly cruel practices, which may have high levels of systemic anxiety and worry, which may have cruel practices. They have existed for thousands of years, but that does not necessarily mean that they are intrinsically good or intrinsically healthy. People learn to cope, unfortunately, with all kinds of social states. But what we are saying here is that whether a concentration camp guard goes home and turns on Mozart and has a tranquil family life and appears to be functioning normally, and goes back the next day to the concentration camp, for example, and commits atrocities, the fact that that person's life is ostensibly healthy and functional does not tell us anything about the ultimate goodness or the ultimate intrinsic health in a spiritual as well as a physical sense of that human being. And the same thing goes with our society. I suspect there's much more leakage in our society, psychological leakage, that we're prepared actually to acknowledge. And there can be barbarous and savage societies which have existed also for thousands of years. For the reason the fact that they survive and that they continue is not a measure or a certificate of their psychological validity, of their psychological truthfulness, of the fact that the human being is what he or she is meant to be. So we cannot appease movements by simply saying people are happy to do this. People feel good doing this. A person will find succor if they're able to take their life. They will find succor if they're able to engage in any kind of sexual relationship or any kind of sexual mutation of their own body. That is not for us going to determine any more than we will allow them to harm other people and say that they find psychological succor through the harm of others. The criterion is not necessarily what a person subjectively likes or wants. The criterion is ultimately in what a person ultimately is. And the reference is that, and the ultimate judgment there is actually not just for us, but for the person's own conscience and the person's own self-transcending perspective. And what Frankl's point is, and this is actually validated by the Noahide laws, is that when the human being activates the spiritual within, when the human being undergoes a process of genuine self-transcendence, then the person will actually, him or herself, acknowledge this ultimate common moral template. The human being will actually discover what he or she is meant to be, and that the ultimate court, if you like, of judgment is not the court of subjective feeling or the court of subjective perception, but it is the ultimate court and validation of this is in the human conscience itself, when the conscience itself is opened up and exposed and bared, so to speak, through the process of self-transcendence. But because we live nowadays in a time of mass repression of the spiritual. And that's why we don't see it. Interesting, though, in many ways, history is a judge, though, because what actually endures, what actually does endure through history are those values which are eternal. And history goes through major aberrations. But when we reflect on what it is that gives stability to a culture, it is very often those values. But the historical record itself, by itself, is not proof, because, as I mentioned before, a society and a human life, for that matter, can live out its span, whether the span of an individual lifetime or the span of a nation's history, and itself have that perpetuated inner spiritual dysfunctionality. It can be a cruel, it can be a barbarous life, however functional it may have appeared on the outside. So the psychology cannot ultimately not be neutral. It cannot admit any values. It cannot say we have no business with what people want. We have to take that as a given, because that actually contradicts the spiritual dimension of the human being, him or herself. How then can the psychologist or the psychiatrist access this spiritual dimension? After all, they not have the background of the patient. And how do you take a spiritual history of each individual, of each person, and grasp that person's belief set? Well, the teaching of this concept of universal values is that these universal values have a common resonance across cultures and between people. They take us to the commonalities, not to the particularities. And therefore, some sort of an awareness, some sort of training for psychologists themselves in what these universal values are is sufficient to meet the patient and to cross cultural divides, because these cultural divides, in fact, have a common resonance in this area of the Noahide laws. So therefore, basically, what we're saying is that psychology is responsible for addressing the human being, not only in the psychophysical, but also in the spiritual dimension. The spiritual dimension is an objective dimension. It's a dimension which is supplied to us by human history, by the history of the human spirit. It's something which resonates right now in every self-transcending individual in any culture whatsoever, provided that self-transcendence is genuinely embarked upon, which means rising above the demands of the psychophysical organism, rising above the demands of feeling, emotion, impulse, perception, and asking what is wanted of me, not what I want of life, but what life wants of me. When the human being is brought to that, says Frankl, everybody will arrive at the same terminus. That is a proposition of Viktor Frankl, and it's an amazing proposition. The atheist, the agnostic, and the religious person will come to the same end station when they embark upon that process which bears the sole name of the process of self-transcendence. And this, therefore, is a plea to all psychologists and to all of us to ponder urgently the spiritual dimension of the human being and how this must be accommodated in psychology alongside all of the techniques and methods which we have presently. Because it's not just it's not just the patient which is at stake here, which is a question, which is a risk here, but it's the culture. Because psychology, in fact, carries the model of the human being, and this is of the utmost cultural importance for the well-being of society and civilization at large. Okay, Chaim, that's it.